BBC Two now explores the legacy of Margaret Thatcher as Alan Clark concludes the history of the Tory party.
In 1975, the Tory party had lost 2 successive elections and its position as the natural party of government seemed to have crumbled. Most Conservatives realised that drastic action was needed. But Edward Heath wouldn't stand down, and none of the men in the shadow cabinet would run against him. In 1975, the cabinet was loyal to its leader, a mistake, if mistake it was, that they were not to repeat in 1990.
But the young Margaret Thatcher decided that she would stand as leader of the opposition.
I don't think anyone can be confident of winning, either Mr. Heath or myself, or a third person or a fourth person. No one can be confident of winning. You can only go on trying to persuade.
I'd just been elected an MP and had attached myself to the Thatcher camp. My task was to ask the new boys how they were going to vote. Airy Neave was running her campaign with the military precision that you would expect from someone who had escaped from Colditz. "Tell them," he said, "that she hasn't got a chance. They must vote for her, because if Heath wins by a landslide, we'll never get rid of him. And anyway, if she gets no votes, it'll look bad for the party with her being a woman," and so on. Actually, in private, he thought rather differently. "My filly is going to win," he said.
No, we've done that. That's quite enough. No, isn't it?
And she did, by 11 votes. She had set the pace, and Pryor, Howe and Whitelaw had to chase her in the second round. Now, more and more, the talk in the smoking rooms was of how good she might be.
Above all, she'd made an impact in debating in the House. She was an extremely effective Commons debater in whatever subject she took up. And when members of Parliament are electing a leader, they want a leader whom they can sit behind and cheer.
One of the great skills of politics is to behave like a caterpillar while you're in a junior position, and then emerge from the chrysalis of the contest, displaying instantly the very different markings of an emperor butterfly.
To me, it's like a dream that the next name in the line, Harold Macmillan, Alec Douglas Hume and Edward Heath, is Margaret Thatcher.
The leader who emerged was remarkable. She thrived on conflict, and her steadiness under fire was extraordinary. I well remember sitting next to her during critical Commons debates and seeing that her hands, as she turned the pages of the brief, were completely steady, a contrast, in my experience, to any other minister who came to the dispatch box. She was cool as well as brave, and sometimes I wondered whether there were not 2 women at war in her body, the impatient radical and the Puritan Grantham goody-goody.
Margaret Thatcher was a mass of contradictions. I mean, she was a very strong Prime Minister and a very strong leader. But she was also, certainly in the first half of her time as Prime Minister, also extremely cautious and extremely fearful.
Of course you have doubts. And you're tremendously aware of the responsibility. But I just haven't come to this out of the blue. I've been in politics 30 years now. I fought my first election in 1950. In British politics, you don't just go from the bottom to the top. You climb your way up the ladder.
The Conservative Party, though, saw Thatcher as a kind of experiment. Let's put a woman in and see how it goes. Most Tory MPs are not preoccupied with ideology. They seldom read the manifesto, and indeed I don't myself. So I don't see the arrival of Thatcher as being a break from the pragmatic, power-driven tradition of politics that dominates this story.
She didn't have an ideological agenda in 1975. I don't think she did for most of the time that she was Prime Minister. I think she became a Thatcherite in, well, about 1987, 1988, when people persuaded her there was something called Thatcherism, to which she was the leader.
In 1979, the party's gamble paid off, and the Conservatives swept to election victory on Labour's disastrous record.
Well, we're not in the least bit tired. We don't think we'll ever get We're staying here. Everyone's here. It's a marvellous party here.
There is a comparison to be made between the early years in government of Margaret Thatcher and Churchill when he came to power in 1940. Both faced a party that was at best ambivalent towards them, and a number of ministers in senior positions who disliked them personally.
I'll bring you all out in a moment.
What brings you here? The boss. The boss.
And then they want us all out.
When she inherited the Conservative Party, she really inherited a sort of two sorts of people. She inherited sort of old-fashioned Conservatives like me, and the rather new-fashioned people like Keith Joseph and so on, who had a rather different view.
The essence of Thatcherism, as it evolved over the next decade, was to be a deregulation of the economy.
Restricting union power, cutting government spending, and a refusal to show any mercy to the industrial dinosaurs. But what made all this possible was North Sea oil. It was the oil revenues that paid for the Glorious Revolution.
Over the next 11 years, in every arena, both domestic and international, the wealth from the North Sea made the difficult possible. Without the revenue from oil, there could have been no Thatcherism. Division grew in the country and in the government. The majority of the cabinet wanted to increase government spending, to ease social unrest and build consensus. Churchill, Macmillan and Heath had all taken this road. It was the traditional middle way.
I was having an argument, a friendly argument with Margaret, and I said to her, Margaret, I'm afraid I can't stop to argue with any longer, because I'm going to the relaunching of Harold Macmillan's book, The Middle Way. It was a slightly provocative remark to make, and she turned to me and she said, Jim, she said, the trouble about the middle of the road is you can get knocked down by traffic coming from either direction.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
The terminology which came into use of wet and dry was, of course, a gift to a paper like the Sun newspaper, who always managed to hang me up on a clothesline, dripping drips of water falling to the ground. It was effective from Margaret's point of view.
But they were not called wets for nothing. They had a majority in cabinet, but they failed to exploit it. And she was still fresh, and she was shameless in appealing over their heads to the country and to us in the tea room. She said, oh, the cabinet are appalling, oh, the government are terrible. And the backbenchers would rally round and agree with her. Now came a nostalgic interlude. A tiny imperial expeditionary force fought a brilliant campaign against huge odds, and a gentleman Secretary of State resigned because his department was shown to be at fault.
It was a great shock, wasn't it, to the British, generally speaking, to find the Argentines invading a British island and taking it over, and it was not only a shock, but considered to be a disgrace. And I think it would have been a very great mistake to have embarked on something like that, when we were having a media and political battle about whose fault it all was.
The Carrington resignation was the last of its kind. In future years, longevity in office would generate a sort of complacency that caused ministers in many similar situations to justify hanging on.
The Falklands War was possible because of North Sea oil, which had made sterling a petrocurrency. Indeed, it was stronger than the dollar. This made us, unlike the Suez debacle of 1956, independent of the Americans, who were against the whole thing. The course of the war has been well documented. The result of the war, in terms of the history of the Tory party, was both to redeem the trauma of Suez and to ensure that Margaret Thatcher got a second term in office.
The party's great success in the 1983 election was a combination of Michael Foot and Galtieri. And I think if you've got, if you can have a war against someone like Galtieri, and if you can have a leader of the opposition like Michael Foot, you're almost bound to win with a big majority.
By 1983, the government's economic rigour had begun to pay off.
With a booming economy and a majority of 144, Margaret Thatcher was in a commanding position. She moved out of the Foreign Office and made Nigel Lawson her Chancellor of the Exchequer. Nigel Lawson was a very clever fellow, always a dangerous thing to be in the Conservative Party. He had a somewhat raffish appearance and long hair, and when she appointed him, Margaret Thatcher told him to get his hair cut, which he did. But it soon grew again, along with his self-confidence.
Margaret Thatcher had her tough new Chancellor in position for the greatest challenge of her premiership.
The National Union of Mine Workers was the traditional bastion of working-class power and the historic enemy of the Tory party. This was to be the head-on crash, the battle that Baldwin had ducked in 1925, saying that there were two institutions he must never take on, the Catholic Church and the NUM, the battle that Churchill and Macmillan had always avoided, and that Heath had catastrophically lost. Now Margaret Thatcher, who had bided her time, was ready to take on the enemy within.
As soon as Scargill became a leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, he wanted to take on the government. And he thought that just as the miners, as he thought, I think mistakenly, had brought down Ted Heath, so that he could bring down Margaret Thatcher.
Her battle plan was faultless. First, she made a preemptive strike against opposition from within the cabinet by making one of the most able, powerful and cunning of the remaining wets responsible for the strike.
She phoned, I've been Minister of Agriculture, and she said to me, well, you've done a marvellous job as Minister of Agriculture, but I want to remove and I want you to go to energy. She said, because I think the greatest threat in this lifetime of this Parliament is going to be Scargill and his attempt to again use militant action and strike action to do damage to the government.
Next, the miners were isolated, out-provisioned, outflanked and outmanoeuvred.
Stocks of coal at the power stations were raised to hitherto unheard of levels, and all other measures were put in place to give us the endurance that we would need if there were to be a strike.
Of course there was a strike, but with unemployment approaching 3 million, union support for militancy was at a low ebb, and the government exploited this.
I had talks with the Trade Union Council, and I agreed what would be done if that he could be persuaded to drop his absurd and ridiculous demands. And I remember sitting there and saying, look, all you chaps around the table, if I offered you the same pay, the same redundancy payments, the same capital investment program as I've offered the miners, would any of you call a strike? And they knew they wouldn't.
Stop it.
Come on,
No,
move.
no way.
Listen, move.
No way.
Listen.
No way.
You're blocking the footpath. Right, arrest him then. He's under arrest.
The government made it clear to the coal board, the miners and the police that the laws on secondary picketing would be interpreted rigorously and applied strongly. When the strike erupted into violence at Mansfield and Orgreave, Margaret Thatcher did not back down and search for a consensus, as many of her predecessors would have done. Indeed, the conflict made her more determined.
I must tell you that what we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law, and it must not succeed.
Conservative victory over the miners wiped out the humiliation of earlier defeats at the hands of the unions, just as victory in the Falklands had erased the memory of Suez. And once again, North Sea oil was the magic factor. Sterling was now a petrocurrency. And whereas in the 1970s, industrial action, as the euphemism had it, at either dockside or power stations, could bring the country virtually to a halt, now, no matter what the degree of trade union disruption, it would not have the slightest effect on the government in power.
The oil revenue was also footing the bill for the 3 million unemployed, a price worth paying, Margaret Thatcher thought, for the restructuring of the British economy.
We're
But you're spending millions, for instance, on the unemployed people.
Yes, indeed. And of course, what you're to do, leave them without any income. Now, I asked you a question, because you're asking facile questions to me.
As Junior Employment Minister, it was my painful task to read out the unemployment total once a month at the dispatch box. This was an ordeal I strongly disliked, if only because it was a harsh reminder of how wasteful our economic strategy was.
One occasion when we were talking about the imperfections in the labour market and the difficulty of really getting labour costs at what the economists refer to as market clearing rates, so that one could help to bring unemployment down. And she, in a sort of outburst, said, what we really need here is soup kitchens. We must have soup kitchens for the unemployed. And obviously I put on one of my rather sort of sickly smiles. As much as say, Prime Minister, you can't really mean that, without actually saying it. She said, Secretary of State, wipe that stupid smile off your face. Well, just like that. So I did.
Margaret Thatcher's merciless economic Darwinism went down well in the city, and the press barons joined the captains of industry in their adoration.
It was valuable to us to know that the government under her leadership would take the position that it did, that it would not tolerate illegalities in the manner that some previous governments had in industrial relations disputes. I mean, she made it clear that she would not tolerate secondary boycotting, and she would enable us to get our newspapers out, provided they were published legally. And this was very important. And I'm afraid it distinguishes her from some of her predecessors. The Telegraph took Thatcherism to the broad band of the Tory middle class. I mean, she sometimes said, well, we hope we can count on you to support us. And invariably, she could.
A whole range of new voters came to see the Conservative Party as their party. The voters characterised as Essex man, also, of course, Essex woman, and not to mention Midland England, man and woman. And we gained new strength from having got rid of an image which belonged to the past.
The ideology of Thatcherism was based on self-reliance, self-improvement, and selfishness. This was to effect a complete transformation on the whole Conservative Party, its social composition, its commitment, and its attitude. There is no such thing as society, Margaret Thatcher said, only groups of individuals. And these words would return to haunt her, and particularly in Scotland, the whole Conservative Party.
Scots are thrifty, conventional and community-minded, all traditional Conservative attributes. Indeed, in 1945, the Scottish vote had saved the party from total annihilation at the polls. But now a number of things had happened to dislocate this relationship. The Scots saw England helping herself to Scotland's oil. England came to be seen as an occupying power, with the Lairds and the Tories as her quislings. And the final straw was that during this time the Conservative Party was led by a woman, and a very English woman at that.
We like people to look as if they fit naturally into the Scottish countryside. And it's nothing to do with how you speak. There are plenty of Scots who speak in a very sort of English way, but are nevertheless thoroughly Scots, and obviously so. Mrs. Thatcher's problem, really, with the Scots was that she did appear to be bossy a lot of the time, and the Scots do tend to like you to be, not to be bossy, rather more to take them with you than to tell them how it is. It's a matter of style, really.
Privatisation was the next leap in the evolution of Thatcher's Britain. It attacked a bastion of union power, increased efficiency, and made considerable amounts of money for the government and for many potential Tory voters.
Sometimes some of the most interesting political developments often are breaking through a sort of invisible barrier of disbelief. I mean, I'd sat through innumerable conferences and discussion groups and so on, when it had generally been assumed that you could not privatize the major public utilities, until we started to do it. And it was very exciting. And look at it now. Virtually nothing left.
In 1987, Margaret Thatcher secured her third term in office. By 1987, local government was the last remaining stronghold of pre-Thatcherite Britain. And people like Norman Tebbit were telling her, we've cut them off from the unions, we've chased them out of the House of Commons, now let's break their hold on local government. Domestic rates were fearfully unpopular, particularly in Scotland. And I remember when in Cabinet Committee, I first heard of the poll tax, or community charge, as we were instructed to call it. It really sounded like quite a good idea. The traditional Tory line, once the poll tax started to go wrong, would have been pragmatically to temper your policies and rein back. But Margaret Thatcher had become convinced by her own record. She had won everything else, although it had always been difficult. She thought she just had to drive through the opposition. But to dramatize everything and to demonize your opponents carries with it the inherent risk that in the end you will fall. By 1989, Margaret Thatcher was the longest-serving Prime Minister for 150 years. In her lengthy premiership, there were a succession of favourites. Humphrey Atkins, whose protégé she was. Ian Gow, who was hopelessly devoted to her. John Moore, who was her golden boy. Norman Tebbit. She stopped trusting Tebbit when he became party chairman. Cecil Parkinson and David Young were the last to lose her favour. The problem is that heirs are always, as with Eden and Churchill, resented by incumbents. And there are always intriguers to sow dissent and gossip between the leader and the anointed. On the 7th of May 1989, the entire parliamentary party was assembled in the Savoy Hotel to celebrate Margaret Thatcher's 10th year in government. I remember well the atmosphere in the room. It was a curious mixture of triumphalism and resentment, which is hardly surprising as more than half the people there had at one time or another been slighted, sacked, or overlooked.
It was my duty and pleasure to make a speech in her honour at that time. Of course, we all knew, as in any organisation, that there were tensions, and we would not necessarily all cheer every word that she'd said to the Echo. But we were delighted to be able to pay tribute to a formidable record of leadership. Nigel Lawson says that he was chafing beside me because he thought that I was really laying it on a bit thick.
This was the last occasion on which she could have been assassinated, the first, of course, being the Brighton bomb, and gone straight to the pantheon of our political deities. And the fourth plinth in the members' lobby of the House of Commons would not have remained, as mysteriously to this day it still does, empty. By now she was also in a minority in her own cabinet over Europe, facing a foreign secretary and a chancellor who were convinced that sterling should join the exchange rate mechanism.
She was not really in favour of the idea at any time, although there was a moment when she thought maybe this would be a good idea, and that was in 1985. And then she went off it again. The rest of the time she was totally off it. And then it became a personality issue with, I mean, who is going to prevail? You know, she or me? And when it comes to that, obviously she prevails because the Prime Minister does.
No minister likes to resign. Walking away from power is not a characteristic of politicians. Eden did it and came back as PM. But most ex-ministers are the day before yesterday's men. Margaret Thatcher realised this, and often she would call their bluff at the same time as she was tweaking their noses. But finally, in October of 1989, Nigel Lawson had had enough and he walked out. The first Chancellor of the Exchequer to resign since Peter Thornycroft left Macmillan's government in 1958. And his place at the crease was taken by John Major. Then, a year later, the worm turned, and Geoffrey Howe, having been insulted, ignored, and demoted over Europe, finally left the cabinet.
It must sound, I suppose, sexist to say, but we had been in partnership together for 15 years, from the time of her election in early 75. And there are not many marriages that last that long these days.
The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
Margaret Thatcher had fallen victim to the bunker syndrome. Everyone round you is clicking their heels. The saluting sentries have highly polished boots and beautifully creased uniforms. But out there at the front, it's all disintegrating. The soldiers are starving, in tatters and makeshift bandages. Whole units are mutinous and in flight.
I am persuaded that I now have a better prospect than Mrs. Thatcher of leading the Conservatives to a fourth electoral victory.
Margaret Thatcher failed to get enough votes to win the first ballot. When I went to the Commons the next day, the atmosphere was one of total anarchy. After the coup, the palace was empty. The servants had fled. Every single channel of communication had gone dead. This was essentially a backbench revolt, comparable only to the Carlton Club Rebellion of 1922.
All that evening, Margaret Thatcher consulted with members of her cabinet. She saw them singly, thinking perhaps that this would be a more effective technique than confronting them fully assembled around the cabinet table. But in fact, each in turn told her the same thing. She was going to lose at the second ballot. When I finally got to see her, it was very late, and I too told her that she would lose. But I urged her to fight on, thinking it would be a heroic and an appropriate ending. She, though, shrank from the humiliation of having to concede defeat to Heseltine, and was appalled at the damage he would inflict on all that she had achieved.
This remarkable woman was finally evicted by the party she had pulled up from the depths because, as can often happen in an intimate relationship, time had turned love into irritation and disdain.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
But although no longer in the driving seat, Margaret Thatcher might, she believed, still be in the back seat, telling her successor where to turn and when to indicate.
Well, the Conservative Party always had a collective guilty conscience, and probably rightly so, over the way in which it removed Margaret Thatcher. And that collective guilty conscience, I think, did have a very significant effect on the government over the next few years, because it made it more difficult to make changes in policy that were necessary.
I don't think Margaret Thatcher was really a conservative. She was too much of a radical. She didn't believe in conserving. And certainly she was completely out of sympathy with that traditional Tory ethic of one nation. The shock therapy of Thatcherism had forced Britain to modernize its dinosaur economy. And the Tory party had evolved too, but in a manner that was to divide rather than unify the nation.
John Major, the last of Margaret Thatcher's golden boys, stood against Heseltine in the second round.
That evening I ran into Bob Worcester, the boss of Moray. "Take a look at this," he said, and handed me the latest poll figures. These showed that although the electorate were more likely to vote for Heseltine than for Thatcher, they preferred John Major to either of them. MPs didn't really want to vote for Heseltine. Now they had a reason not to. And as soon as these figures were published, Heseltine's leadership campaign would effectively be over.
The change came about because people wanted a different style, they wanted a different tone, they felt we were jarring too much with the course of events, and they wanted to go to John Major because he would present same direction of policy without all the constant clashing and stridency that by then was just the dominant theme of Margaret's premiership. I think they wanted Thatcherism with a human face.
John Major won the second ballot, 54 votes ahead of Michael Heseltine.
The very first quality that struck me about John Major was his extraordinary politeness. He had the most beautiful manners, never flapped. And if ever the phrase, "a safe pair of hands," meant anything, it personified John Major. He had always been supremely good at doing what he was told. And now perhaps the right wing thought that it would be them who gave the orders. They would be in charge.
The boom of the late 1980s had turned into an embryonic recession. We had interest rates at 14, 15%. Unemployment was rising very rapidly indeed. The community charge had caused huge trouble in the country. There had been the so-called poll tax riots. Europe was becoming a very divisive issue in the party. From the moment I went into Downing Street, there was a split in the ground, and the Conservative Party had a foot on either side of that split, and it was growing wider on European policy.
But in spite of these problems, 2 years later, John Major won the general election. It seemed the party's ruthless decision to ditch Margaret Thatcher had paid off. I myself resigned my seat at this point. But the general election of 1992 was a draw, not a victory for the Tories. They lost almost 40 seats, and from thenceforward had to operate on a shrinking majority. Muddle, impotence, and frustration were to characterize the next 5 years. John Major's proudest achievement as Chancellor had been to persuade Margaret Thatcher, God knows how, finally to join the exchange rate mechanism. But sterling had entered the ERM too high, and the government and the Bank of England failed to revalue it.
We thought, I think, that this misvaluation of sterling, this overvaluation of sterling, would be defended thanks to the ERM because the Bundesbank would pour all their reserves into defending the exchange rate as much as the Bank of England might pour theirs in.
The previous weekend to Black Wednesday, the Italian lira had devalued. And the Italian Prime Minister had approached us and asked whether we wished to devalue sterling with it. We didn't wish to devalue sterling with it. What happened post the Italian devaluation was that the market was looking for another potential candidate that it could sell, moved to sterling, and there were some very injudicious remarks attributed to the governor of the Bundesbank, which I think fueled the sentiment of the markets. And then the market in all its fury turned upon sterling and began selling it. Our first instinct was to defend sterling within the markets. We put interest rates up firstly by 2%, then subsequently by another 3%.
I can't remember in all my time any government having quite such a catastrophic day. I remember on the day, in the less serious, more black comedy moments, reflecting openly to some of my colleagues, I think, that I'd never been in a government before that didn't have an economic policy.
What happened was the breakdown of a system. It was not that Britain made any mistake, particularly in its implementation of the ERM policy. The whole existence of the ERM may have been a flawed instrument, but it was nothing that Britain did that created the situation. It was the collapse of a system.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism. The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
I considered whether it would be appropriate to resign at that stage, and I took advice from some colleagues and others, and in the event the advice was that it was better on balance to stay and correct what had gone wrong rather than resign. I shall no doubt wonder till the end of my days whether that was the right decision. The most serious single element of what happened on Black Wednesday was that from that moment onwards, people no longer gave the government the benefit of any doubt. It had a very long fuse right the way through the rest of the Parliament.
Black Wednesday and its aftermath gave the Eurosceptics confidence, and the backbench sharks, scenting the blood of the wounded government, thrashed about in shallower and shallower water as its majority drained away. Europe was such a visceral issue that it repressed even that sense of self-preservation which normally gives MPs a semblance of unity. And there was a yearning for Margaret Thatcher, but she was safely tucked away in the Lords. How things would have turned out if she had remained in the Commons is one of the most fascinating conundrums of the period.
What is certainly true is that in the run-up to the crucial Maastricht negotiations on monetary union, the Prime Minister's problems were exacerbated by Margaret Thatcher's inability to keep quiet.
Well, I think there were times when she could have been more supportive than she was. But then in politics, people have strong convictions and strong feelings, and sometimes those convictions and those feelings will out. Before I'd gone to Maastricht, I had set out exactly what I hoped to achieve in negotiations, and had that specifically endorsed in detail by the House of Commons. I had then gone to Maastricht and negotiated exactly and precisely what I said I would negotiate. No changes at all. I then came back to the House of Commons and got a massive endorsement for what I had negotiated. The Danes then rejected the treaty. And on the back of rejecting the treaty, a number of my colleagues in Parliament and commentators outside then decided it was perfectly all right for Britain, that had freely entered into these agreements after consultation in government, after consultation with the other political parties, after the agreement of Parliament, for Britain suddenly to say, we've changed our mind and we'd like to do something else. Now, I don't think you can behave that way.
Now John Major faced a bloody internecine war, pushing the Maastricht Treaty through the House of Commons. This was an impossible situation to be in, but the Prime Minister had no choice. The Maastricht opt-out deal was his most significant achievement. If he couldn't get an international treaty that he had signed, backed by his own party, then his credibility as Prime Minister would be fatally maimed.
It became extremely damaging because here was a government which in my opinion, was doing rather well, my biased opinion, having its day-to-day activity dominated by this extraordinary parliamentary warfare over the Maastricht Treaty, in which I took part. I spent at least 2 days on the floor of the House of Commons myself defending the Home Office bits of it.
The divisions in the Conservative Party were caused by the lack of leadership, and to say that it was the Conservative Party that gave the leadership a difficult time, I think is not true. The reality is that the weakness of the leadership created the divisions in the party.
There'd been a lot of speculation about the leadership, a lot of hints, nods, winks, backstairs briefings that one member or another member was going to stand for the leadership. And some of the Maastricht rebels kept floating the story that they would put up an alternative candidate at the annual November election. And it was entirely self-defeating.
The Conservative Party must make its choice. Every leader is leader only with the support of his party. That is true of me as well. That is why I'm no longer prepared to tolerate the present situation. In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
Now the question was, which of John Major's colleagues would have the nerve to stand against him?
I spent the weekend talking to my wife and my constituency about whether I should resign or not. So I said, well, I'll give it one more try on Monday morning. I'll ring John Major and talk to him about it. I had difficulty in getting through. He was very busy, unfortunately. He's going off to some French location for a European meeting. As it happens, it's always Europe that messes things up. So we had a very short conversation. It was quite clear from the conversation he didn't want to discuss it further, so I resigned on the phone at that point.
Redwood stood against John Major, backed by a bizarre collection of the awkward squad. The traditional Tory pragmatism that kept backbenchers loyal was breaking down.
I and my team are going out to win this election. Yeah. We want to win it in one go. Yeah. That is our aim. That is what we're campaigning for.
Victory over Redwood showed John Major's consummate skill at manipulating the Conservative Party. From now on, his position as leader seemed secure. But there was a deeper problem in the party, and this was exploited by an able and manipulative opposition. The number of former ministers taking seats on the board of the privatised utilities gave an impression of nest feathering, which was harmful to the party. This baffled some Conservatives. Surely it was straightforward capitalism, rewarding success, all part of the Thatcherite ethic. But there was a murkier area of financial corruption, itself a reflection of the way in which the party was spinning out of control. Some MPs appeared to believe that blatant self-interest was itself a sufficient justification for what they were doing. Now, it seemed, no such thing as society had actually entered the Conservative Party.
There were a number of people who misbehaved. Some of them were rather foolish. The issue was very heavily hyped for a whole range of reasons in the 90s, even though many of the instances related back to the 1980s.
I re-entered politics in 1996. And when John Major called the general election for May 1997, I was in the happy position of prospective candidate for the second strongest seat in the country.
Vessel, Mr. Major's battle boat. He's a man you immediately like. He's immediately very warm, very holds your hand and shakes your hand, but puts another hand on your elbow. I think people find that when you look at him, you trust him, you feel as though you're going to trust him, and you do.
That's my wife.
There you go, I'm having a busy time.
Thank you very much, yes. I'm going to win this. Step back. No, step back, please.
It was not until the very last Sunday of the campaign that the Conservative leadership found themselves admitting, although still only to themselves and never even in front of subordinates, that a serious defeat was in prospect. Every single device for measuring popular opinion was pointing consistently in the same direction. A Labour landslide, a true landslide on the scale of Churchill's defeat in 1945, was now on the horizon.
I was specifically with John Major. I still find it difficult not to call him the Prime Minister. I was with him on the tour, and it was very similar to 92 in that we still had, even then, we had people coming up, congratulating, wanting to shake his hand. There was no animosity, there was no turning away, and with the experience of 5 years ago, you thought to yourself, well, the polls must be wrong again.
I think one of the reasons there was no hostility in 1997 was because the electorate had made up their mind. We're basically an apolitical nation. I think they had made up their mind to trust the Labour Party. They saw no purpose in being hostile to a Conservative politician.
On election night, every individual MP is imprisoned in the town hall at his own count. It's very difficult to get a clear picture of what is happening across the country, although rumours of a massacre occasionally filtered through.
The number of votes cast for each candidate at this election was as follows. Bear, Edward, 218. Clark, Alan Kenneth Mackenzie, 19,887. And I hereby declare that Alan Kenneth Mackenzie Clark is elected as the Member of Parliament for the Kensington and Chelsea constituency.
Mostyn Neil Hamilton.
By midnight it was apparent that the Conservative Party was in meltdown.
A massive defeat for Neil Hamilton.
Mellor, David.
Results were pouring in, some recording swings to Labour of almost 20%, unprecedented in any election since 1906.
A truly terrible night for the Conservatives.
In a way, the last election, 1997, was all about the Conservative Party. That was the main subject of the debate. Not our policies, not our ideas. We'd won the battle of ideas. Our policies were imitated by our opponents. But about the Conservative Party itself, was it still a party of government? And we'd had enough scandal, and enough public rows, and enough dissidents for people to think, no, they're not, and they put the Labour Party in instead.
Since 1922, the Conservatives had been the natural party of government, by stressing unity and consensus, always preferring pragmatism to ideology. Yes, the party had its greatest electoral success during the Thatcher years, when it abandoned this formula. But in demeaning the public sector, crushing the unions, and crippling local democracy, great damage had been caused to the traditional fabric of the nation state. In May 1997, they paid the price.
One of the difficulties of the last 20 years is that we have tended to emphasize the strong aspects, the brace yourself in cold water aspects of the Conservative Party too much, and concentrated too little on the social aspects of conservatism that have always been there, are there today, and I hope will always remain there.
There is now little left but question marks. How must the party change? Should it return to the one nation tradition or push further out with a radical right-wing agenda? To whom can it look for leadership? In 1922, The Conservatives had found rejuvenation, breaking away from a coalition that was exhausted and out of touch. Now the party is in that same position itself. How feasible is it going to be for them to repeat their achievement of 75 years earlier?